Eyewitness picked feeds and the sensor logs recovered from the Emperor's Children reconnaissance elements present a consistent if harrowing pattern. Approach vectors that once registered as open space abruptly collapse into localized storms and static. Vox channels fail in clusters, and dropped insertion teams find themselves surrounded by living architecture and the twitching, shadowed shapes of predators that are at once alien and familiar. Archaeological teams later described the planet's surface as a palimpsest of biological engineering. Structures that at a distance read as petrified forests and basalt spires, but on closer inspection proved to be grown lattices of chitin and calcified filament, many scarred by the imprint of armour and man-made metals. Reports from surviving legionaries, archivists who examined recovered Astartes war gear, and the limited field notes preserved by the Interex liaison all converge on the same elemental fact. The invaders encountered on that world were not solitary, isolated beasts nor simple leviathans. They were a patterned, adaptive organism with social organization and technologies that blurred the boundary between organism and armament. For field historians cataloguing the episode, the name applied by the first Imperial forces has endured. Contemporary records place the Megarachnids as a sentient arthropoid clade, confined when first encountered to a single death world, variously recorded as 14020, Eurycerach, and more commonly in Imperial dispatches as Murder. Surviving narrative from the expeditionary fleet and subsequent logistical reconstructions indicate that the species had once possessed interstellar capability and, according to Interex testimony, had been expelled to their world after a protracted and devastating conflict. The Interex interdiction, as described in their communiques, removed the Megarachnids' capacity for space travel and effectively quarantined their species to the planetary biosphere. Imperial campaign accounts that follow describe a rapid, violent contact during which conventional landing doctrine failed in multiple sectors because of atmospheric turbulence and deliberate organismic interference with drop and communication systems. The primary contemporary literary appearance of the encounter is in the chronicle later published as Horus Rising. Scholarly summaries and tertiary archives draw on that source for the most detailed narrative of the initial contact and its immediate consequences. Taxonomically, the Megarachnids are consistently recorded across archival summaries and field reports as a multiform arthropoid clade that converges visually on the Terran conception of large predatory spiders. Most standard depictions and eyewitness descriptions agree on a general body plan: a segmented, heavily sclerotized carapace, a posterior trunk composed of reinforced tergites, and multiple paired appendages differentiated into locomotory and manipulative sets. Normal warrior class specimens encountered by the Emperor's Children and Blood Angels were routinely described as taller than a space marine in power armor, with some examples of larger phenotypes reaching orders of magnitude greater in size. Frontal appendages frequently terminate in elongated blade-like talons, an apparent biologically grown integument that behaves as both weapon and manipulative tool. Field anatomical notes remark that many of these talons exhibit a composite microstructure, giving them cutting properties sufficient to damage or penetrate power armor at close quarters. Eyewitness testimony variably reports the absence or near absence of optical organs in many specimens, suggesting heavy reliance on alternative sensory modalities such as seismic chemosensory and low-frequency electroreceptive systems. Where contemporary codification has been attempted, sources avoid anthropomorphic language and prefer descriptors such as clades, broods, and caste morphs to convey the species' internal diversity. Population estimates at the time of contact are necessarily provisional. Imperial personnel who later examined ecological surveys and the remains of nests and breeding pits judged that, at the height of the Megarachnids' pre-exile expansion, their effective population across a hypothetical empire would have numbered in the billions, distributed across dozens, if not hundreds, of occupied worlds. By the time the Interex enacted their containment strategy, and later, when the Great Crusade forces made first contact, the species was spatially concentrated and demographically compressed. Planetary surveys and surface excavations on 14020 noted extensive brood chamber complexes and layered deposition zones where exuviae, cast cuticle, and nutrient matrices accumulated. These physiologies and the associated reproductive architectures indicate a life history strategy oriented toward high output of smaller, rapidly maturing workers and specialized morphs that could be directed toward construction, predation, or territory defense. Exact ratios of caste or average lifespan cannot be stated from surviving records. Field analysts prefer to frame demographic descriptions in functional terms: workers, hunters, breeders, and what the Interex and early Crusade reports call engineer forms, rather than precise percentages. The origin narratives surrounding the Megarachnids fall into two concurrent categories that appear repeatedly in both primary expeditionary logs and in later in-universe analysis. The first is a strictly empirical reconstruction, a lineage of complex colonial arthropods that developed bioengineering capabilities, allowing environmental modulation and rudimentary spaceflight, an expansion that drew conflict with nascent human polities and ultimately provoked the Interex countermeasures that confine the species. The second thread is a set of interpretive mythos and conjecture that circulate in off-duty conversations among legionaries and in fringe academic circles. Notions that the Megarachnids are the byproduct of ancient biowar programs, the descendants of engineered war beasts, or that their adaptive behaviors indicate a form of distributed cognition bordering on the Gestalt. Official records treat these latter accounts with caution. Where theory lacks evidence, it is explicitly labelled as speculative. For analytic purposes in the present archive, the founding hypothesis remains that the Megarachnid clades represent an autochthonous xenophyletic lineage whose technological expression took an organic vector rather than the metallic constructs typical of human or mechanicum manufacture. Their material culture, insofar as it can be distinguished from biomechanical growth, is described consistently as organic technology. Field observers wrote of structures grown from a stone-like secretion that nevertheless possessed lattice microstructures resembling waveguides and antenna arrays. The most frequently cited examples are the so-called trees, monumental growths distributed across the landscape that interfered with standard Vox transmission and drop telemetry. These formations, when analysed by Mechanicus teams with appropriate caution, exhibited layered filarial tissues intercalated with mineralised channels that produced both atmospheric modulation and a jamming field for electromagnetic communication. Close-range engagement reports also note that certain airborne phenotypes could use a corrosive envenomation, and that others carried hardened appendages capable of slicing power armour. At least one surviving Space Marine account emphasised the difficulty in separating where organism ended and weapon began. It is important to underline that descriptions of the Megarachnids' technology are not claims that they crafted metal engines in the same manner as human forges, but rather that they directed biological growth processes to produce functional analogues to electronic and atmospheric instruments. When considering recruitment or the means by which Megarachnid groups expand and specialise, the archives show a pattern of local biosphere integration rather than exogenous acquisition. The species appears to orchestrate developmental plasticity through environmental triggers and chemical signalling, brood morphogen gradients, pheromonal cascades, and nutrient allocation corridors that bias larval development towards specific morphs depending on colony need. Contemporary anatomical studies performed by Interex xenobiologists and sampled in later Mechanicum notes indicate that newly hatched forms are initially pluripotent in function, and that caste channeling occurs early in ontogeny. This system allowed rapid reconfiguration of colony resources in response to invading forces, a feature repeatedly remarked upon in tactical after-action synopses as the cause of the Megarachnids' operational resilience. There is no indication in primary records that recruitment takes the cultural or ideological forms seen in human societies. Instead, adaptability appears to be a combination of evolved genetic programming and emergent colony-level decision processes. That emergent aspect is what led some analytica and field psychiatrists to tentatively attribute a form of distributed cognition to the clade, even while noting such language as metaphorical rather than literal. The material interface used by the Megarachnids, weaponized appendages, corrosive secretions, and grown environmental devices presents a tactical profile of short-range ferocity combined with strategic environmental denial. In open terrain, the species' mobility and numbers allow for rapid encirclement and attrition. In zones influenced by their engineered growths, their interference with drop and vox coordination produces the conditions for piecemeal isolation of enemy elements. It is for these reasons that the initial Imperial landings suffered disproportionately. Cortical command was repeatedly degraded during insertion phases, leading to fractured engagements and high casualty rates, even where Astartes forces secured local tactical successes. Clinical descriptions from recovered battle logs also record instances of unusually large morphologies, referred to sporadically as titaniform or megaphenotypes, that match the functional role of heavy assault units. These examples are rare in the surviving literature but significant in that they exhibit structural reinforcement and appendage morphology consistent with engagement at scale against armoured targets or even tracked vehicles. Some field sketches included in less formal archives show forms with mass and reach comparable to a siege engine, though these remain outliers in the corpus of reports. Analysts who have surveyed the extant materials caution against conflating rare gigantism with a canonical species-wide trait. Rather, these specimens appear to arise under certain environmental or developmental conditions, and are therefore best thought of as morpho-variants rather than a separate taxon. Where these heavy phenotypes were present, the operational picture shifted. Astartes units found themselves confronting single organisms capable of absorbing and redirecting enormous kinetic loads, forcing commanders to commit heavier ordnance and to rely on Titan support when available. Survival narratives and field recoveries emphasize that the Megarachnids were not merely predatory, but that their colonies exhibited a form of intentional spatial engineering that functioned simultaneously as habitat, trap, and sensor array. The growth described as trees, or jamming pillars, served to shape weather, to mask bioacoustic signatures, and to channel fauna toward kill zones. Post-battle ecological surveys described trophic webs that had been actively rewired by the colonies, prey species redirected by the construction of nutrient traps, saprophytic communities established around brood pits, and fungal symbionts that assisted in rapid repair of damage to the colony's structural tissues. These observations, taken together, present a picture of a species whose survival strategy blended opportunistic predation with a sophisticated use of environmental manipulation, an approach that explains both their historical success prior to exile and the particular difficulties they pose to an invading tech-reliant force. The surviving dossier on the species therefore combines observational data from expeditionary logs, anatomical notes filtered through Interex and Mechanicum analysis, and post-action environmental studies that together form a provisional but coherent portrait of the organism's capacities, behaviours, and material culture. The Megarachnids left behind no clear system of recorded language, symbolic communication, or enduring monuments that could be read as a deliberate attempt to preserve a cultural history. Instead, what the Adeptus Mechanicus and Administratum recovered from the surface of 14020 were ecological traces, adaptive growth structures, and fragments of oral testimony from the Interex who had long observed them. This lack of conventional record-keeping has forced all subsequent analysis into comparative zoology, mythic inference, and cross-referencing with hostile reports from the Imperial forces that fought them. From a scientific perspective, the most widely supported account situates the Megarachnids as an autochthonous species, a clade that evolved on a world of high atmospheric turbulence, corrosive precipitation, and predator-saturated ecosystems. Their morphology is consistent with arthropoid analogues that arise in multiple biospheres, segmented exoskeletons, redundant limbs, and multiple redundant sensory channels. The archaeological profile of their world suggested that the Megarachnids reached a stage of civilizational development that took a radically different trajectory from human societies. Instead of industrial metallurgy, their technological development appears to have been based upon the manipulation of growth processes, the secretion of hardened organic composites, and the directed evolution of morphs suited to tasks that other species might assign to machines. In this sense, their science was indistinguishable from their biology, and their history is encoded less in written records than in the ongoing structures of their hive forests and mineral chitin arrays. There are, however, mythic and speculative accounts that diverge from the purely evolutionary explanation. Some Mechanicus xenobiologists argued that the Megarachnids' extreme specialization, particularly their ability to grow structures that mimic the functions of electronics, suggested an origin in ancient bioengineering rather than natural evolution. One rumour, recorded in Inquisition summaries, speculated that they were remnants of a warbeast program from the Dark Age of technology or even earlier, left to proliferate until the Interex curtailed their expansion. There are even fringe theories that their apparent hive mind-style decision processes and ecological dominance might have drawn the attention or influence of the warp. These accounts, however, remain unsupported by concrete evidence. Chaos-based origins are sometimes whispered in connection to their aggression and alien cognition, but no confirmed evidence of warp taint, sorcerous energies, or psychic weaponry has been documented in association with the Megarachnids. The balance of canonical sources therefore continues to frame them as a purely material species whose menace derived from biology and adaptation, not demonic corruption. Their population structure is better understood, at least at the time of Imperial contact. As noted in recovered surveys and combat reports, the Megarachnids organized themselves into colonies numbering in the tens of thousands, spread across vast stretches of terrain. These colonies could interlink, forming sprawling ecological networks where growth structures shaped the environment to the species' advantage. When extrapolated to a planetary scale, the effective population on 14020 likely reached into the hundreds of millions. Analysts who attempted retroactive estimates of their pre-quarantine empire speculated that during their height, prior to their confinement, the Megarachnids may have maintained a population in the billions across numerous worlds. As for individual stature, the warrior forms encountered by the Emperor's children were consistently described as exceeding the height of a transhuman in full power armor. Most reports suggest that the average combat morph stood between 3 to 4 meters in height, with a mass estimated at several hundred kilograms. Larger phenotypes, occasionally encountered during prolonged engagements, are reported to have exceeded 5 meters in height and carried a bulk comparable to Imperial dreadnoughts, though these remain exceptional. Smaller castes dedicated to construction, scouting, or brood care were not as frequently observed in battle but were discovered in captured nests and brood pits, typically ranging from 1 to 2 meters. The variance across morphs implies that the species maintained a caste-based structure, with physiology directed by brood environmental triggers rather than genetic limitation. Distinctive traits of the species were evident both to their enemies and to scholars cataloguing their physiology. Their primary weapon systems were integrated directly into their anatomy. Serrated talons grown from hardened composite keratin chitin, mandibles capable of shearing metal, and internal venom reservoirs capable of secreting corrosive enzymes. Accounts mention their ability to navigate vertical surfaces with ease, supported by clawed appendages that allowed them to swarm over fortifications and armoured vehicles. Sensory modalities appeared to bypass vision in favour of seismic and chemical detection, allowing them to function effectively even in darkness or when obscured by environmental interference. Perhaps most striking to Imperial forces was their apparent indifference to injury. Many accounts describe Megarachnids fighting on with limbs severed, ichor pouring from wounds, continuing their assault until their nervous systems were fully destroyed. Recruitment, or more accurately reproduction and caste assignment, was conducted biologically rather than culturally. Brood chambers discovered in subterranean warrens revealed mass spawning, with eggs clustered around nutrient-rich matrices. Developmental analysis suggested that larvae could be directed toward particular morphologies through pheromonal and chemical conditioning, producing the rapid expansion or replacement of caste groups depending on battlefield demand. In effect, the Megarachnids possessed the capacity to replenish specialized combat units with speed and efficiency, a factor that made them particularly dangerous when faced with a protracted campaign. Where humans recruit and train, the Megarachnids simply grew what they required. Their technology was inseparable from their bodies and their environment. The most famous example of this was the growth of towering tree-like constructs that disrupted Imperial Vox networks and orbital telemetry. These were not static structures but living bioantennae, composed of filamentous tissue that interfered with electromagnetic signals. Their durability exceeded that of rockcrete, and bombardment often proved insufficient to permanently destroy them, as the colonies could regenerate the structures from surviving tissue. In addition to these jamming arrays, Megarachnid technology encompassed an array of corrosive secretions, engineered symbiotic organisms, and massive growths that acted as fortifications. Observers noted that entire forests of bone-white towers were in fact engened. In addition to these jamming arrays, Megarachnid technology encompassed an array of corrosive secretions, engineered symbiotic organisms, and massive growths that acted as fortifications. Observers noted that entire forests of bone-white towers were in fact engineered barriers, absorbing kinetic energy and concealing brood chambers within their interiors. Weaponry was similarly organic. Bladed talons were their primary close-range weapons, but some morphs carried internalized projectile systems, such as venom-spitting glands or silk-propelled harpoons. While not equivalent to Imperial bolters or lasguns in raw penetrative power, these natural weapons were lethal at close range and extremely effective in attritional engagements. Notably, these weapons required no logistics chain, no resupply. They were self-sustaining and regenerated over time. As for tools, what limited Mechanicum observations reveal is that the Megarachnids used their own bioengineered morphs as living instruments. Construction morphs secreted resins and built structures, while other specialized morphs acted as movers, diggers, and engineers. The line between tool and organism does not apply in the same way as in human societies. The Megarachnids embodied their technology within themselves. Vehicles in the conventional sense were absent. No wheeled, tracked, or anti-grav constructs were observed. Instead, the Megarachnids relied on their own morphs to fulfill vehicular roles. Larger titaniform specimens acted as living war engines, battering through fortifications or carrying broods on their carapaces. The colonies themselves could be considered vehicles of a sort, slowly expanding across landscapes, consuming and assimilating territory until an environment became a fortified megastructure. The Interex records that the Megarachnids once possessed spacefaring craft, but after the enforced quarantine, these technologies were destroyed or denied to them. What vessels they once commanded were never seen by Imperial observers, leaving only speculation as to whether their ships had been organic in nature, hybrid constructs, or appropriated technology from earlier conquests. This combination of biology, technology, and environmental manipulation distinguished the Megarachnids from nearly every other foe encountered during the Crusade. To fight them was not to battle an army supported by machines and logistics, but to enter into conflict with a biosphere that itself was weaponized, where every wall could be a living trap, every tower a signal jammer, every forest a fortress. The surviving data on the Megarachnids into the realm of individualized accounts and behavioral tendencies. Unlike human empires or many other xenos races, there is no clear evidence that the Megarachnids produced individuals who can be described as political leaders, monarchs, or strategists in the human sense. The archives do not contain names, sigils, or genealogies that can be tied to ruling figures. Instead, when Imperial sources or the Interex referred to leaders, they were describing either caste-specific morphs that appeared to direct colony behavior, or particularly large specimens that exerted control over the lesser organisms in their vicinity. These were understood not as sovereigns, but as command nodes within a distributed colony structure. One category noted repeatedly in combat reports is that of the dominant morphs. These were significantly larger than the standard warrior form, often towering well over 4 meters in height, and possessing a thickened, layered carapace that provided exceptional durability. They were marked not only by size but by an array of extended manipulatory appendages, each tipped with elongated talons or scythe-like growths. Field notes describe these dominant morphs as the ones around which other megarachnids would rally during combat. Lesser morphs altered their movements in coordination with these larger organisms, as if the dominant specimen were issuing a set of pheromonal or tactile instructions to direct attacks. In this way, they filled the function of a commander. Their behavior demonstrated an ability to reorient swarm movements rapidly, redirecting entire broods to exploit breaches or to encircle isolated Imperial units. For this reason, the Emperor's children began to target these morphs specifically, recognizing that killing a dominant node created a momentary fracture in enemy cohesion. Closely related to these were the engineer forms, which the Mechanicus later documented as the primary architects of the organic jamming towers and brood nests. Though not usually seen at the forefront of combat, they represent a form of leadership within the colony structure by directing the growth and repair of environmental constructs. Survivors from Imperial forces recalled that when an engineer form was present, new growths appeared rapidly in the environment, suggesting that these morphs either secreted key compounds or emitted command signals that induced accelerated construction. While not leaders in a martial sense, they represent the species' capacity to project long-term strategic influence over a territory. Beyond these command morphs, the closest equivalent to specialized units are the caste-differentiated broods deployed during the battles on 14020. Warrior forms represented the standard frontline combatants, with scything talons and a height sufficient to dominate human soldiers. Heavy assault morphs were the outliers in both scale and capability, reaching sizes comparable to small war engines. Reports describe these titaniform specimens breaching Imperial lines, shrugging off bolt fire, and in some cases forcing the deployment of heavy ordnance or Titan-class war machines to contain them. Smaller hunter morphs fulfilled the role of scouts and skirmishers. Their lighter frames and rapid movement allowed them to harass flanks, chase down fleeing infantry, and move quickly across vertical surfaces to disrupt fire teams. Finally, broodguard morphs, recorded near nests and growth complexes, acted as defensive units that resisted intrusion into colony strongholds. The war machines of the Megarachnids must be understood not as vehicles or constructs, but as the titaniform and megaphenotype morphs themselves. To Imperial observers, their size and resilience placed them in the same category as dreadnoughts, or light titans. In the accounts from the Emperor's Children campaign, there are descriptions of massive creatures that could overturn armor columns, using limbs as battering rams and crushing claws. These were not common, but their existence required Imperial strategists to adapt, bringing in heavy armor and orbital support. The distinction between organism and war machine collapses in these cases. The Megarachnids' largest phenotypes were their war engines. Behaviorally, the Megarachnids demonstrated a set of instincts and tendencies that remained consistent across encounters. The first was aggression toward any intrusion into their territory. Reports from both the Interex and the Great Crusade noted that attempts to approach or land on their world were met with overwhelming force, regardless of the size or identity of the intruding force. This suggests a deeply ingrained territorial instinct, perhaps reinforced over millennia of exile and confinement. Second, their coordination displayed a form of collective intelligence. Units did not act as isolated individuals but as extensions of a colony mind. Observers noted their ability to shift formation, adapt to changing battlefield conditions, and even execute feigned retreats or ambush tactics. The Mechanicus interpreted these actions as evidence of a pheromonal or bioelectric communication system, allowing rapid dissemination of signals. In practice, this gave them a behavioral advantage similar to a highly trained, disciplined army, without the need for verbal commands. Third, their persistence in combat bordered on the relentless. Many records highlight their refusal to withdraw, even when faced with catastrophic losses. Warrior forms fought until physically destroyed, ignoring injuries that would incapacitate other species. This behavior gave the impression of a species that lacked individual self-preservation instinct, subordinating all survival to the colony's needs. Such determination has been interpreted as an instinctive drive rather than conscious fanaticism, yet the effect on Imperial troops was similar to fighting zealots and capable of fear. Another behavioral trait noted was their capacity for rapid environmental adaptation. Colonies reshaped terrain to their advantage, using growth towers to disrupt communications, burrowing to emerge beneath enemy positions, and even redirecting fauna to supplement their hunting strategies. This tendency reflects not only biological adaptation, but also strategic awareness, making them uniquely dangerous in protracted campaigns. Finally, their interactions with other sentients reveal a lack of negotiation or accommodation. The Interex claimed to have engaged them in war until they stripped them of spacefaring capacity. During the Great Crusade, there were no recorded attempts by the Megarachnids to parley, to communicate, or to acknowledge Imperial envoys. Their instinct was simple and consistent: to eradicate intruders. This behavior indicates that the Megarachnids either lacked the capacity for diplomacy as humans understand it, or that their evolutionary history had produced a society where communication beyond the colony was unnecessary. The conclusion of this part is that the Megarachnids' most famous leaders were not sovereign individuals but dominant morphs that acted as command nodes. Their units were not regiments, but castes of morphs fulfilling specific ecological roles. Their war machines were not forged constructs but titaniform bodies, and their behavioral tendencies reflected an instinctive, collective, and relentlessly territorial nature. This combination created the impression, for those who faced them, of fighting not merely an enemy force but an entire hostile ecosystem mobilized for war. The earliest comprehensive evaluations of the Megarachnid species by Imperial authorities were not drafted in the immediate aftermath of contact. Initial exposure to their existence came through fragmentary battlefield observations, preserved in the aftermath of the compliance of murder, and later through collated testimony from the Lunar Wolves Legion, the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, and the associated support personnel. However, it was only after the War Master formally ordered the Mechanicum's representatives within the fleet to catalogue their technology and biology that true administrative and logistical studies began. The Adeptus Administratum, tasked with contextualizing the conflict in terms of Imperial expansion, and the Adeptus Mechanicus, tasked with technological investigation, approach the same subject matter from starkly different perspectives. Yet together, their preserved records form one of the most comprehensive datasets on a hostile xenos species encountered during the Great Crusade. The Administratum's interest lay primarily in establishing what role, if any, the Megarachnid could play within the Imperium's vast administrative structure. This included assessment of their population densities, their territorial spread across the planetary system of murder, the implications for integration or extermination, and the long-term costs of campaigns waged against them. The Adeptus Mechanicus, meanwhile, focused on their technological principles, methods of construction, biomechanical integration, and possible adaptations of their war gear into Imperial arsenals. These two perspectives occasionally clashed in their conclusions, yet both converged on one central finding. The Megarachnid were not an incidental species, nor a remnant population. They were a structured civilization, with planetary-level mastery of infrastructure, able to sustain widespread military operations through biological industrial synthesis. Their defeat at murder was costly, not because of their scale alone, but because they represented a form of enemy architecture that challenged established Imperial models of technological supremacy. The Administratum's census-style estimations placed the Megarachnid population of murder in the billions, with projections suggesting a near-exponential reproduction cycle. Unlike most species that required centralized habitation clusters, the Megarachnid were distributed across the planetary surface with alarming density. Their hives, which doubled as war fortresses and territorial markers, operated as both population centers and strategic nodes. Each hive was thought to contain several 100,000 to millions of organisms, ranging from fully developed combat adults to immature brood stages. A comparative analysis produced by the Administratum noted that if even a fraction of these hives reproduced at standard observed rates, the planetary biomass of the species would outstrip the capacity of most exterminatus-level protocols to fully cleanse. This reproductive surplus created what Administratum clerks termed a perpetual replenishment cycle. In practical terms, this meant that even significant battlefield attrition could be sustained indefinitely. For the Imperium, the implication was stark. Eradication of the Megarachnid would require total planetary devastation, not mere decapitation strikes. The Mechanicum's analysis added nuance to this assessment. They confirmed that the Megarachnid reproductive cycle was biologically regulated by environmental saturation. When a planetary biosphere reached certain thresholds of nutrient availability and atmospheric composition, brood chambers would accelerate spawning processes. This biofeedback loop ensured that the Megarachnid would always reach equilibrium with their environment, maintaining maximum sustainable density. Thus, eradication would demand not only the destruction of their bodies, but also the dismantling of the very ecological frameworks they had engineered across Murder. The Administratum classified the Megarachnids' most notable feature not in their physiology, but in their instinctual territorial expansionism. Unlike many species that prioritize defense of established hive cities or concentrations of wealth, the Megarachnid continuously advanced into unclaimed zones, constructing new hives at a relentless pace. This required constant redrawing of maps and constant recalibration of troop deployments, since no Imperial force could rely on static geography. For every grid square cleared, 2 more became contested. Administratum cost estimates for pacification operations suggested that a standard compliance campaign against such a species would require 50% higher manpower allocations and double the normal supply lines of a comparable planetary conquest. The sheer unpredictability of their expansions meant that Administratum scribes often appended caveats of indeterminate finality to their reports, a rare designation in the otherwise rigid bureaucratic framework of the Great Crusade. The Adeptus Mechanicus found the Megarachnid to be one of the most anomalous species encountered during the Crusade, specifically because their technology blurred the line between machine and organism. Their weapons were not constructed in the same sense as human-forged arms, but rather grown, cultivated, and then hardened through an industrial biological process. Close analysis revealed that their wargear exhibited traits of self-repair, with broken limbs of mechanical spider drones reconstituting after periods of dormancy. This was achieved through microspore dispersal, a process by which damaged systems were regenerated through organic layering. To the Mechanicum, this appeared dangerously close to a form of auto-evolutionary machine intelligence, though not truly sapient. Several magi argued that such biomachinery skirted the boundaries of abominable intelligence, making it ideologically suspect as well as militarily dangerous. Administratum conclusions aligned in practical terms. Any weapon or vehicle that could reproduce or repair itself without centralized manufacturer represented an enemy threat requiring complete eradication. To permit such technology to persist was to permit the spread of an uncontrollable contagion. Standardized Megarachnid weapons included bladed appendages reinforced with crystalline growths, venom injectors that delivered paralytic toxins, and ranged bioprojectiles that discharged chitin shards at hypersonic velocities. The Mechanicum noted that these ranged weapons were not separate tools but integrated into the creature's biology. In some cases, autopsies suggested that warriors could adapt their weapon configuration's midlife cycle, altering their combat role depending on environmental pressures. Administratum commentary on these findings stressed the near impossibility of enforcing the standard compliance dictum of disarmament. A species whose weapons were internalized could not be regulated through treaties or decrees. Their very biology was a perpetual arsenal. This conclusion underscored why the War Master's decision to classify the Megarachnid as extermination-level hostile was justified, even from a purely administrative standpoint. By the end of the campaign on Murder, both Administratum and Mechanicum reports converged on the same ultimate conclusion. The Megarachnid were an existential threat to the Imperial model of conquest and assimilation. Their population cycles, self-repairing technology, and unyielding expansion made them incompatible with integration. From the administratum's perspective, they were a perpetual drain on manpower and resources. From the mechanicum's perspective, they were a technological heresy threatening to supplant human dominion over machine process. Together, these evaluations shaped one of the clearest extermination edicts of the Great Crusade era. The Megarachnid were not to be catalogued for assimilation. They were to be erased, not because of ideological divergence alone, but because logistics and analytics both demonstrated that nothing less would secure Imperial hegemony. The earliest confirmed contact between the Imperium of Man and the Megarachnid took place during the Compliance of Murder, a campaign that was not initially classified as a major military undertaking. The War Master's 63rd expedition had expected to bring another isolated system into the fold with minimal resistance, following standard compliance doctrines. Initial auger scans of the world showed abundant atmospheric anomalies, a heavily forested terrain punctuated by vast crystalline formations and what were believed to be scattered fortifications. No central planetary authority was detected, and administratum projections noted that resistance, if present, would likely be scattered and localized. These assumptions were rapidly invalidated once landfall occurred. The Lunar Wolves Legion deployed ground forces with the intent of mapping and pacifying local population centers. What they encountered instead were autonomous killing zones, regions where the Megarachnid had not only entrenched themselves, but had actively reshaped the biosphere to funnel invaders into narrow corridors. Reports preserved from these engagements describe the terrain itself as an active weapon, with dense forests acting as concealment for sudden ambushes and crystalline tower structures functioning as both communication relays and artillery nests. For the Imperium, this was the first indication that the Megarachnid had not been a declining species hidden on a single world, but a power capable of maintaining planetary-scale military organization. The first battles were disasters for the Imperial landing forces. Entire companies of lunar wolves were enveloped in coordinated assaults by Megarachnid broods that struck with synchronized precision. Standard battlefield analysis logged their method of war as encirclement saturation, a tactic in which multiple broods closed from multiple vectors simultaneously, overwhelming the ability of Astartes to respond with disciplined fire lanes. Administratum records note that casualty projections for these opening days exceeded normal compliance rates by nearly 600%. Tactical withdrawal was ordered repeatedly, yet each retreating column was harried by rapid pursuit, with Megarachnid forces matching or exceeding the speed of Imperial infantry advances. The fighting style of the Megarachnid was unlike that of most xenos encountered by the Imperium, where orcs relied on brute force and mass assault, and Eldar relied on precision strikes with small elite units. The Megarachnid combined elements of both in a hybridized approach. Their warriors charged with physical power sufficient to crush armor plating and splinter ceramite, yet their assaults were coordinated through what appeared to be instantaneous communication. Observers suggested the existence of a hive-like neurological network, allowing disparate groups to act in total synchronization without visible leaders issuing commands. The result was a species whose battlefield presence was both overwhelming in scale and unnervingly efficient in execution. The Adeptus Mechanicus compiled data on their weaponized appendages during these early battles, noting how their crystalline shard projectiles were employed to saturate kill zones at range, softening targets before the main assault closed. Warriors were often preceded by waves of smaller subspecies that served as both scouts and expendable attrition units. These minor organisms forced Astartes into breaking formations to address multiple threats simultaneously, creating openings for larger Megarachnid forms to exploit. Administratum analysts later classified these smaller entities as logistical shock assets, functioning as natural equivalents to reconnaissance drones and suppressive infantry. The culmination of these disastrous engagements occurred when the Imperial assault columns pressed toward the central crystalline hives. Here, the Megarachnid revealed their greatest strength: the integration of environment, biology, and war machine. Massive biomechanical constructs emerged from subterranean vaults, functioning as mobile fortresses and siege engines. These were described by Lunar Wolves veterans as towering forms bristling with crystalline protrusions, capable of launching shard storms that cut through infantry ranks with ease. More significantly, these machines could disgorge entire broods of warriors from within, ensuring that every engagement rapidly escalated beyond the manageable scope of standard Imperial assault doctrine. It was only the intervention of the Interex, another human-derived civilization that had prior conflict with the Megarachnid, that ultimately shifted the balance of the war. The Interex had designated the world of Murder as a permanent quarantine zone, containing the Megarachnid with advanced containment technology. To them, the Imperial presence represented a dangerous disruption of a carefully maintained cordon. Their records revealed that the Megarachnid had once spread beyond Murder, expanding aggressively until checked by Interex countermeasures. The war machines deployed by the Megarachnid against the Lunar Wolves were remnants of this larger campaign, dormant until awakened by the Imperium's intrusion. From this collaboration, the Administratum was able to piece together a fuller picture of the Megarachnid's wider history of conflict. Their wars were not isolated planetary skirmishes, but system-spanning conquests. The Interex recorded that multiple neighbouring systems had fallen under Megarachnid expansion centuries prior, requiring sustained campaigns to burn them out. What the Imperium faced on Murder was, in fact, a wounded remnant of a once expansive power, still capable of overwhelming an Astartes legion if mishandled. The fighting style of the Megarachnid was consistently defined by three principles. The first was relentless territorial assertion. Once they emerged into a region, they would construct fortifications with incredible speed, raising hives and defensive structures in a matter of days. The second was saturation through numbers, not in disorganized waves, but in structured multi-layered assaults, where small broods softened defenses for larger organisms to exploit. The third was total environmental integration, where the terrain itself was reshaped to favor their strengths and punish intruders. Administratum analysts noted that these principles mirrored, in unsettling fashion, the Imperium's own approach to conquest: swift expansion, overwhelming force, and total utilization of infrastructure. Notable battles recorded within Imperial and Interex archives highlight the adaptability of the Megarachnid. In engagements against the Interex, they had demonstrated proficiency in spaceborne boarding actions, sending swarms of smaller organisms into enemy craft to sabotage systems before larger entities breached hulls. In planetary sieges, they displayed the ability to dig beneath fortifications, collapsing walls from below and infiltrating through subterranean passages. In open battlefields, they relied on massed frontal assaults supported by their crystalline artillery towers. Each environment was exploited differently, but the underlying doctrine was consistent: establish dominance by destabilizing enemy formations and prevent recovery through sustained pressure. Within the campaign on Murder itself, the most infamous engagement was the Battle of the Valley of Towers. Here, Lunar Wolves' spearheads attempted to cut through a dense cluster of crystalline structures believed to house communication nodes. Instead, the towers functioned as amplifiers for the Megarachnid's coordination, allowing unprecedented levels of synchronized assault. Records indicate that hundreds of Astartes were killed within hours, their formations shattered by overlapping arcs of shard fire and ambushes by warrior broods concealed among the towers. Only with concentrated orbital bombardment were the Wolves able to secure a tenuous foothold, and even then, resistance continued for days. Another significant battle was the defense of the Imperial encampments established on the southern hemisphere. Megarachnid broods launched a series of night assaults, striking at supply lines, communication arrays, and heavy equipment. The Mechanicus logged these attacks as targeted disruption campaigns, noting the deliberate prioritization of infrastructure over direct casualties. The Administratum's commentary on these engagements emphasized the sophistication of Megarachnid strategy, suggesting that they were capable of long-term planning rather than simple instinct-driven aggression. The final major battle of the campaign came when the War Master himself coordinated the full force of the Lunar Wolves and the reinforcements of Allied forces against the central hive clusters. This was a brutal confrontation that combined orbital bombardments, ground assaults, and sustained mechanized pushes into enemy territory. The Mechanicus recorded that the Megarachnid deployed their largest war machines in these final days, constructs so massive that they withstood repeated barrages from Astartes' heavy weaponry. These biomechanical fortresses required concentrated fire from entire companies to bring down, often at the cost of dozens of casualties. Administratum records emphasize the sheer expenditure of manpower and munitions in these final assaults, a scale of resource consumption that rivaled campaigns against far larger empires. The end of the conflict did not result in the extermination of the Megarachnid by Imperial hand alone. The Interex, still maintaining their quarantine protocols, intervened to assist in containing the remnants. Their technology allowed the suppression of Megarachnid biosignals, disrupting coordination and reducing them to disorganized assaults. With their networks fractured, the Megarachnid finally succumbed to the concentrated firepower of Imperial and Interex forces combined. These records serve as one of the most detailed case studies of xenos warfare encountered during the Great Crusade. The Administratum concluded that the Megarachnid represented a uniquely dangerous enemy, not only because of their numbers but because of their organized fighting style, which mirrored Imperial military doctrines in alien form. The Mechanicus emphasized the danger posed by their biomechanical war machines, which they regarded as blasphemous imitations of true machinecraft, yet still recognized their effectiveness. The legacy of these battles shaped the Imperium's policies on xenos eradication for centuries thereafter. The Megarachnid demonstrated that an enemy need not possess warp sorcery, star-spanning empires, or advanced void naval fleets to constitute a significant threat. A species capable of rapid expansion, environmental mastery and coordinated battlefield dominance could devastate even the most disciplined Imperial forces if underestimated. Administratum records following the compliance of murder consistently cited this campaign as evidence for a doctrine of extreme caution when encountering unknown species. Mechanicus commentary went further, suggesting that even fragments of Megarachnid biotechnology, if left unchecked, could reconstitute into viable military threats. The Megarachnid was thus recorded not as chaotic alien violence, but as disciplined, structured warfare conducted through biological means. Their battles were memorable not simply for the casualties they inflicted, but for the way they challenged Imperial assumptions of superiority. Every engagement revealed a species that thought, fought, and constructed on scales uncomfortably close to mankind's own methods, forcing the Imperium to confront the possibility that it had not simply encountered another enemy to crush, but a mirror of its own expansionist tendencies taken to alien extremes. The compiled eyewitness accounts of the campaign against the Megarachnid are among the most extensive non-human engagement records recovered from the Great Crusade. Surviving warriors of the Lunar Wolves, officers of the attached Imperial Army regiments, and field personnel of the Adeptus Mechanicus contributed first-hand descriptions of the battles. Their combined testimony, preserved in Administratum archives, provides a layered picture of how the Megarachnid operated in both tactical encounters and large-scale engagements. One of the earliest recorded eyewitness accounts came from a sergeant of the Lunar Wolves who had fought in the opening engagements on the planet Murder. His company had advanced into what appeared to be an abandoned settlement of crystalline towers, intending to establish a fortified position. Instead, he reported that the towers began emitting vibrations, followed by sudden bursts of shard projectiles launched from concealed orifices in the crystal structures. Within moments, his company was caught under crossfire that seemed to come from the terrain itself. Then the ground split, and warrior forms erupted from concealed burrows. The sergeant's account describes a scene in which his men were attacked from above and below simultaneously, their bolter fire partially effective but insufficient to suppress the sheer density of incoming threats. He noted that the warriors fought silently, without vocalization, and pressed their assault even after sustaining catastrophic injuries. According to his record, the Megarachnid advanced until they were physically incapable of further movement. The engagement was recorded as a total loss for his company, with only a handful of survivors pulled out by later reinforcements. This style of sudden overwhelming encirclement was repeated across multiple battlefields. Administratum analysis categorized the pattern as a deliberate strategy rather than opportunistic behavior. The Megarachnid, unlike orc warbands or other instinct-driven swarms, displayed a consistent ability to anticipate the likely avenues of approach for Imperial forces. They placed their towers and nests at key choke points, ensuring that any movement into their territory triggered a pre-arranged ambush. The Mechanicus calculated that this level of coordination required advanced biosensory systems distributed across the environment, possibly linked to the towers that dotted the landscape. Another first-hand testimony came from a Mechanicus engine seer attached to a forward observation unit. His account describes the destruction of an armoured convoy moving through a valley between two tower clusters. The convoy was composed of Chimera and Rhino transports with heavy weapon support. As the column advanced, vibrations were detected through the ground, and within minutes, the leading transport was overturned by subterranean creatures erupting directly beneath its treads. The following transports attempted to reroute, but the valley walls sprouted crystalline protrusions that released a volley of shards. The engineer described how the convoy was pinned in place, with its mobility stripped away, before waves of Megarachnid warriors descended from both the cliffs and the ground. The destruction was near total. The engineer himself survived only because he was buried beneath debris during the initial collapse, later extracted by recovery units. His report highlighted the Megarachnid's ability to merge environmental sabotage with direct combat, a hallmark of their doctrine. In the larger battles of the campaign, such as the push toward the central hives, the Megarachnid escalated their use of warmorphs. Here, eyewitness accounts describe organisms so vast they were likened to moving fortresses. One account from a Lunar Wolves captain tells of a titaniform morph that breached his defensive line, shrugging off last cannon strikes and smashing through fortifications. According to his report, it required the combined fire of multiple Predator tanks and heavy weapon squads to bring the creature down, and even then, it continued moving forward for several minutes after sustaining mortal damage. Administratum analysts noted that these engagements drained Imperial munition stocks at alarming rates. A single titaniform organism consumed the equivalent firepower that would normally be allocated for mechanized companies of a human opponent. The aftermath of these battles was catastrophic, not only in terms of casualties, but also in the destruction of infrastructure. Mechanicus reports detail how communication systems were consistently rendered inoperative by the jamming effects of the crystalline towers. Vox transmissions were disrupted, Auspex readings distorted, and long-range coordination rendered unreliable. This technological interference ensured that Imperial forces often fought in fragmented units, isolated from one another and unable to coordinate effectively. Administratum records highlight that in the absence of orbital support, many of these fragmented groups were annihilated in detail. The most disturbing eyewitness reports came from survivors of night assaults against Imperial encampments. Several accounts describe the sudden emergence of Megarachnid scouts within the perimeter, slipping through unseen tunnels or breaching from beneath hab structures. These scouts targeted sentries and officers first, creating panic before larger broods arrived. Witnesses reported that these smaller morphs moved with uncanny silence, their claws penetrating ceramite and steel without difficulty. Panic often spread before defenses could be fully manned. Entire camps were overrun in less than an hour in multiple incidents, with survivors later describing the battlefield as a landscape of shredded armor and torn bodies. Administratum officials later logged these incidents as evidence of the Megarachnid's deliberate prioritization of command disruption, a tactic rarely seen in purely instinct-driven species. The final analysis of these campaigns from the Administratum perspective was sobering. They calculated that casualty figures for the initial weeks of the compliance of murder exceeded the standard attrition rate for a legionary force by over fivefold. Losses in equipment were equally devastating, with multiple armoured companies lost to environmental entrapments. munitions expenditure exceeded projections by such margins that resupply became a major logistical crisis, requiring emergency convoys from orbit to maintain operational capacity. From the perspective of the administratum, the campaign demonstrated a profound failure in initial threat assessment. A world catalogued as lightly defended had in reality contained a xenos presence, capable of rivaling major hostile empires in combat capacity. The Mechanicus conclusions, however, focused less on the logistical strain and more on the technological implications. Their analysis determined that the Megarachnid towers represented a form of integrated biotechnological warfare system, both generating interference and serving as physical fortresses. They noted that the speed with which new structures appeared during the campaign suggested an adaptive construction process that defied known Imperial engineering principles. Some engineers speculated that these towers might have been semi-autonomous growths triggered by pheromonal commands, allowing the Megarachnid to erect fortified positions in days rather than months. To the Mechanicus, this represented a dangerous precedent, a species that could convert an unprepared world into a fortress in a fraction of the time required by human industry. Eyewitness accounts also contributed to the understanding of Megarachnid psychology, or lack thereof. The repeated observations that warriors fought without fear, without vocalizations, and without retreat reinforced the conclusion that individual self-preservation was entirely absent from their behavior. Astartes veterans likened them to living war machines, each body a disposable weapon in service of the whole. The Administratum contrasted this with other species encountered by the Imperium. Orcs, for example, might break into infighting or retreat if morale shifted. Eldar might disengage once objectives were threatened. The Megarachnid, by contrast, pressed their assaults regardless of circumstance. Their casualties treated as irrelevant to the overall strategy. This made them uniquely difficult to counter, as no intimidation or morale-based tactic could ever break their lines. The aftermath of the campaign was one of severe reassessment within the Imperial hierarchy. The Administratum entered the Megarachnid into the highest category of xenos threat, recommending permanent extermination protocols and the establishment of a strict quarantine. The Mechanicus concurred, adding that their technology posed a corruption risk to Imperial machinecraft if samples were ever allowed to proliferate. Even as the species was reduced to remnants by the combined might of the Imperium and the Interex, the records emphasized that their capacity for resurgence could not be discounted. The fear was not merely that surviving broods might remain hidden, but that fragments of their biotechnological systems might regenerate in isolation. In retrospect, the campaign revealed to the Imperium a stark lesson in the dangers of underestimation. An entire legion had been nearly overwhelmed not by an empire, but by a single species confined to a single world, yet capable of deploying armies, fortifications, and war machines on par with far greater foes. The Administratum analysis concluded that future compliance protocols should always assume maximum resistance, until proven otherwise, a doctrine that influenced subsequent Crusade operations. The Mechanicus' final judgment was more severe. The Megarachnid were to be categorized as a blasphemous echo of the proper union between flesh and machine, a violation of the machine god's order, and thus deserving of complete eradication. Together, these impressions form the closing commentary of Imperial records in this phase of the campaign. Eyewitness testimony confirmed the brutality of the fighting, aftermath analysis revealed the unsustainable resource cost, and the final assessments urged vigilance against any possibility of resurgence. For the Imperium, the war with the Megarachnid was not simply another compliance, but a grim warning of how quickly an underestimated enemy could consume vast reserves of lives and material. Though officially marked as concluded, the tone of the Administratum and Mechanicus reports reveals an unease that lingers even in archival form, a recognition that what was fought on Murder was not merely a species, but an entire ecosystem armed for war, extinguished at terrible cost and remembered as one of the most dangerous xenos threats ever encountered during the Great Crusade. The preserved records of the Inquisition concerning the Megarachnids are fragmented, with much of the material locked behind sealed data caches and restricted vaults. access is granted only to senior agents with clearances marked under the ordo xenos, and even then the documentation is often heavily redacted. Surviving fragments suggest that the Inquisition never regarded the campaign against the Megarachnids as merely a matter of military conquest. Instead, they treated the species and their empire as an anomaly that warranted deeper investigation, primarily due to the structural complexity of their civilization and the methods by which they appeared to maintain territorial cohesion. While Imperial forces catalogued the Megarachnids as hostile and xenocidal, the Inquisition layered its records with more cautious terms, noting unexplained consistencies in their population management, unusual planetary engineering, and puzzling signs of long-term planning that belied their bestial appearance. Early observations taken from Inquisitorial observers attached to the Great Crusade forces noted that the Megarachnids demonstrated patterns of settlement across multiple planetary systems that defied the typical scattering of a non-human empire. Where many xenos species fragmented into isolated cultures when spread across large distances, the Megarachnids appeared uniform. Their fortress spires were replicated with precision, their subterranean hives structured with consistent mathematics, and their fortifications arranged according to principles of geometry that seemed closer to mechanical logic than to natural adaptation. This prompted early Inquisitorial assessments to question whether the species had at some point been guided or modified by a higher order of intelligence. The possibility of external tampering, whether by the Old Ones, the Necrontyr, or even unknown forces tied to the warp, was raised, though never confirmed. The records emphasize that no direct evidence was ever recovered, but the consistency of their structures across dozens of worlds was regarded as a mystery unresolved. Unexplainable findings are scattered through the recovered reports. Several Expeditionary Mechanicus teams, later co-opted into Inquisition archives, reported faint residual energy traces embedded within Megarachnid fortresses. These traces did not correspond to any known power source employed by the xenos species, whose weapons and tools appeared to be crude by comparison. One record notes that an entire fortress spire, breached by the lunar wolves during compliance, contained sealed chambers with walls composed of a mineral structure that did not match the geology of Murder. The stone bore unnatural resonances, as though infused with low-grade warp interference. The chambers contained no inhabitants and no technology beyond dormant architectural features, yet their presence suggested that Megarachnid construction carried a deeper purpose beyond mere defense. The Inquisition later theorized that these fortresses may have served as more than strongholds, possibly as beacons or monitoring stations, whose true function had been forgotten by the species themselves. Other documents highlight biological anomalies. Autopsy reports performed under Mechanicus supervision found evidence of accelerated cellular regeneration in megarachnid tissue, far exceeding that of most known organisms of similar size. Injuries that would cripple or kill an ordinary predator were observed to heal within hours under controlled testing conditions. Some recorded specimens displayed dormant genetic markers, described in notes as folded strands, that hinted at unused or latent biological potential. Inquisitorial commentary suggested that the Megarachnids may have been subject to genetic manipulation at some point in their history, possibly to serve as guardians or enforcers for another power. These suggestions remain unproven but appear multiple times across the archives, indicating a persistent suspicion rather than isolated speculation. The unexplainable extends also to their patterns of communication. Field agents attempting to monitor their coordination noted the absence of any centralized command structure. Unlike the Tyranids, who display hive-mind behavior, the Megarachnids showed no signs of psychic resonance or warp-based synapse. Yet their battlefield maneuvers indicated coordination on a scale that exceeded what could be achieved through simple instinct. Another area of observation involved their hostility to spacefaring intruders. The Inquisition stressed that the Megarachnids appeared programmed or conditioned to destroy any arriving vessels, regardless of intent. This blanket hostility was documented as more than territorial instinct, as it extended to an immediate response from every inhabited world within the system once a breach was detected. A vessel entering orbit above Murder or its neighbouring planets would be met by atmospheric defenders within minutes, followed by ground-based anti-orbital assaults if it lingered. The precision of this response suggested a form of interplanetary alarm system, yet no such devices were ever identified by Imperial surveyors. The phenomenon remains one of the more enduring mysteries within the Seal. Squadrons of aerial forms and ground-based war machines synchronized their assaults with mechanical precision, creating kill zones and encirclements that rivaled human strategic planning. No linguistic transmissions were detected, no radio frequencies intercepted, and no psychic broadcasts measured. This void in communication methodology was marked as a significant anomaly in Inquisition records, one that remains without satisfactory explanation. Another area of observation involved their hostility to spacefaring intruders. The Inquisition stressed that the Megarachnids appeared programmed or conditioned to destroy any arriving vessels, regardless of intent. This blanket hostility was documented as more than territorial instinct, as it extended to an immediate response from every inhabited world within the system once a breach was detected. A vessel entering orbit above Murder or its neighbouring planets would be met by atmospheric defenders within minutes, followed by ground-based anti-orbital assaults if it lingered. The precision of this response suggested a form of interplanetary alarm system, yet no such devices were ever identified by Imperial surveyors. The phenomenon remains one of the more enduring mysteries within the sealed archives. The Inquisition also recorded an unexplained discrepancy between the apparent level of Megarachnid technology and their effectiveness in battle. Their weapons, while formidable, lack the sophistication of plasma weaponry or warp-tide technology. Their fortresses, though vast and durable, did not exhibit signs of advanced power generation, yet their forces inflicted losses on some of the most disciplined legions of the Great Crusade. The discrepancy raised the question of whether their true strength lay not in their tools, but in their collective biology and their ability to adapt. Some reports describe shifts in Megarachnid battlefield behaviour from one engagement to another, as though they were learning and recalibrating strategies based on enemy patterns. The Inquisition flagged this adaptability as a sign of latent intelligence concealed beneath their monstrous exterior. A final and persistent mystery noted in the Inquisition's impressions was the near-total absence of preserved Megarachnid artifacts following their extermination. Despite the scale of their empire, few tangible remnants were recovered. Vast fortresses collapsed after their inhabitants were destroyed, their structures degrading with unusual speed. Weapons and armour retrieved from the field often dissolved or corroded within weeks, as though designed to prevent long-term study. This impermanence made detailed analysis difficult, and some within the Inquisition proposed that it was intentional. Whether the Megarachnids themselves engineered this degradation, or whether it was the legacy of some earlier influence, remains an unanswered question. These unresolved findings, scattered through restricted files and redacted logs, underscore why the Inquisition never fully closed the matter of the Megarachnids even after their eradication. Officially, they were catalogued as extinct, their threat neutralized during the Great Crusade. Unofficially, the Ordo Xenos continued to circulate classified documents, warning that the origin, nature, and true purpose of the Megarachnids had never been conclusively established. The absence of survivors, combined with the anomalies embedded in their architecture, biology, and tactics, left lingering doubts that their story ended with their destruction. Some files conclude with a simple cautionary phrase repeated across multiple records: species removed, purpose unknown. The sealed records of the Inquisition dealing with the aftermath of battles against the Megarachnids emphasize that their extinction did not bring closure. Rather, it generated additional anomalies that required decades of analysis. Field reports compiled by agents embedded with the Crusade forces describe inconsistencies in the destruction of Megarachnid colonies. In some instances, entire hives ceased activity once a primary fortress spire was destroyed, their remaining warriors collapsing into inert husks as though deprived of an unseen controlling force. In other cases, resistance continued long after their command structures were obliterated, with scattered warbands fighting with even greater ferocity, as though triggered into a final act of defiance. The inability to establish a single consistent behavioural pattern led the Inquisition to question whether the Megarachnids functioned through multiple layers of coordination, some rooted in biological instinct, others dependent on structures or unknown sources of influence. Documented encounters often highlight phenomena that defied conventional expectations of warfare. One of the most heavily redacted accounts concerns the assault on an outer colony, world adjacent to Murder. Imperial forces noted that the planet's atmosphere was seeded with artificial particulate matter, creating a constant haze that obscured orbital reconnaissance. Attempts to disperse the clouds revealed that they contained microscopic filaments of organic material. Analysis by Mechanicus tech priests, later classified under Ordo Xenos oversight, concluded that the particulate may have been deliberately engineered by the Megarachnids as a form of planetary-scale sensor or alarm system. When Legion forces descended through the haze, ground defenders emerged in precise formations despite the absence of visible communication. The suspicion was raised that the very atmosphere of the planet had been modified into a networked field of detection, though no permanent samples survived beyond the initial invasion. Another recurring observation recorded in Inquisitorial dossiers is the Megarachnids' capacity for rapid structural adaptation. Fortresses breached during one campaign often showed alterations when compared to spires on other worlds. Walls would be thicker, entry points restructured, and defensive apertures adjusted to counteract tactics previously employed by the legions. This led to the troubling suspicion that the species maintained a method of transmitting battlefield lessons across interstellar distances, even though no known psychic or technological mechanism could account for such rapid communication. Some Inquisition analysts suggested the presence of dormant relay systems embedded within their fortresses, but these were never located. Others speculated that their genetic coding may have allowed for accelerated evolutionary responses triggered by exposure to specific forms of warfare. This hypothesis, though not proven, was circulated in internal memos with the warning that such a trait would make the Megarachnids uniquely dangerous if any survived undetected. The most disturbing sealed reports revolve around unexplained disappearances during the campaigns. Several Legiones Astartes squads were recorded as missing in action, with no trace of their remains found in subsequent searches. The assumption of battlefield destruction was initially accepted, but the pattern of disappearances grew concerning when it was noted that entire formations vanished without corresponding wreckage or casualties. Inquisition investigators hypothesized that the Megarachnids may have possessed hidden substructures within their hives, designed not only for defense but for the capture of enemy combatants. This theory was supported by the discovery of a series of underground galleries lined with organic residue that did not match the native biology of Murder. Samples were confiscated and sealed, marked with warnings that the material exhibited faint warp resonance under Auspex scans. No definitive conclusion was reached, but the implication was that the Megarachnids may have been conducting experiments or maintaining reserves of their foes for purposes unknown. Eyewitness accounts preserved by the Inquisition also note the psychological effect of combat against the Megarachnids. Legionaries and human auxiliaries described sensations of being watched long before enemy contact, as if the landscape itself was aware of their movements. This sensation was not attributed to fear or anticipation, as even veteran Astartes reported it consistently. On some occasions, warriors claimed to hear faint vibrations or pulses running through the ground before assaults began. These phenomena were cross-referenced with seismic recordings, which detected rhythmic tremors coinciding with Megarachnid troop movements. The Inquisition suggested that the Xenos may have employed subterranean resonance as a means of coordinating across vast areas, but the persistence of the psychological sensation beyond measurable tremors left lingering questions. Unexplainable anomalies were also noted in the aftermath of battles. Entire fortress complexes collapsed within days of being vacated by Megarachnid defenders, often without direct demolition. Structures of immense durability seemed to lose cohesion, as though dependent on the continued presence of their inhabitants. This phenomenon was particularly troubling to the Inquisition, as it made post-battle analysis nearly impossible. What little architecture could be preserved degraded at an accelerated rate, frustrating attempts to archive technological or cultural evidence. Some Inquisition theorists speculated that the species engineered their constructs with built-in failsafes to prevent their enemies from exploiting them. Others suggested a more disturbing alternative, that their structures were not entirely inert, but symbiotic with the species themselves, decaying when deprived of their biological presence. The surviving sealed reports conclude with warnings that the extermination of the Megarachnids cannot be regarded as an absolute certainty. Though the Lunar Wolves, Blood Angels, and Emperor's Children successfully purged Murder and its surrounding systems, the possibility of remote colonies surviving beyond Imperial records was never dismissed by the Inquisition. The documented adaptability of the species, combined with their ability to modify both biology and environment, left open the possibility that fragments of their empire could have withdrawn into uncharted space. The final remarks in Ordo Xenos files often end not with statements of closure, but with directives for vigilance. Absence of evidence does not equate to extinction, one memorandum states, underscoring the lingering unease that the Megarachnid threat may persist in hidden corners of the galaxy. The records of the Inquisition that deal with Megarachnid war encounters are fragmented, often preserved only in sealed transcripts and coded summaries, where Imperial Army and Legionary accounts provide open reports of victories, losses, and logistical figures. Inquisitorial files lean toward the unexplained irregularities and troubling patterns that emerged during the campaigns. These are not tales of singular battles, but of consistent anomalies that defied cataloguing by the administratum. In every recorded conflict with the Megarachnids, features appear that suggest the xenos operated according to principles that went beyond ordinary warfare. The most persistent anomaly noted across sealed reports is the irregular collapse of Megarachnid strongholds after battle. Fortress spires that withstood direct orbital bombardment and ground assault for days would, once abandoned, degrade within hours. Materials that had resisted melter charges or Astartes' heavy weaponry would soften, crack, and crumble into dust. This phenomenon was recorded on Murder and on its satellite worlds, though no mechanism was ever isolated. Inquisition analysts questioned whether the structures possessed a form of bioreactivity tied to the living Megarachnids. The implication was that their fortresses were not static constructions but extensions of their species, degrading once that connection was severed. Some theorists even proposed that the fortresses may have functioned as anchors, tethered to their collective presence, collapsing when deprived of sustaining energies. No samples preserved outside sealed vaults ever retained their stability. Battlefield anomalies also appeared in the movements of Megarachnid forces themselves. Multiple encounters describe coordinated maneuvers without visible command structures. Squadrons of aerial forms and ground war machines engaged in pincer movements that rival the tactical planning of the most disciplined human armies. Yet no commanders were identified, no signals intercepted, and no psychic activity detected. In one sealed record from the Ordo Xenos, an attached Mechanicus observer describes a Megarachnid counterattack unfolding in exact sequence to counteract a Lunar Wolf's flanking maneuver, despite the fact that the Xenos could not have had prior knowledge of the formation. The report was marked with the phrase predictive adaptation, a term used to denote the suspicion that Megarachnids may have been capable of anticipating enemy strategies through an unknown sense or latent intelligence. Several documented encounters record the disappearance of entire Imperial detachments. In a campaign fought on one of Murder's outlying colonies, 3 full companies of auxilia vanished after breaching a Megarachnid hive. The survivors of the wider campaign reported no bodies, no armor fragments, and no battlefield wreckage. The only sign of their passage was the sudden silence of Vox contact, which ceased mid-transmission. Subsequent searches by Astartes found subterranean galleries lined with organic residue, but no trace of the missing troops. The residue was later analysed under Inquisitorial seal and found to possess faint warp resonance. This discovery was classified immediately, with the note that xenos use of extra-dimensional processes cannot be excluded. The matter was left unresolved, but it entered Inquisition annals as one of the most troubling irregularities of the entire compliance. Another category of sealed reports centres on planetary conditions. In at least 2 documented war zones, the atmosphere appeared artificially modified. Legion warriors described descending through dense cloud banks laced with particulate that clung to armour and interfered with Auspex systems. Mechanicus adepts later determined that the haze was not natural, but composed of microfilament structures of organic origin. The suspicion was raised that the Megarachnids employed atmospheric modifications as planetary-scale surveillance, detecting intrusions by the displacement of their airborne filaments. This theory was never confirmed, as no intact samples survived transport off-world. Inquisitorial notes emphasize that such environmental engineering, if intentional, would indicate strategic sophistication far beyond the apparent bestiality of the species. Several encounters also raised the possibility of warp-linked anomalies. In one campaign noted only in redacted fragments, Astartes forces breached a Megarachnid fortress to find chambers built of non-native mineral, infused with low-level warp echoes. No defenders were present, and the chambers contained nothing but barren surfaces. Yet Auspex scans recorded fluctuating energy patterns for days afterward. The files conclude abruptly, with the entry sealed under Ordo-Xenos oversight. The lingering question of why the Megarachnids would construct such chambers and whether they were aware of the warp resonance has never been resolved. Eyewitness accounts preserved by Inquisitorial agents highlight further oddities. Legionaries reported the sensation of being observed from within the landscape itself. This was not simple anxiety, but a recurring claim from multiple veterans of the campaign, including commanders. Some described faint vibrations beneath their feet hours before assaults began, a phenomenon later correlated with seismic readings that showed rhythmic pulses beneath Megarachnid hive networks. The pulses were not consistent with tectonic activity, and ceased immediately after major Megarachnid defeats. Inquisitorial analysts concluded that the xenos may have employed subterranean resonance as a communication method, one that doubled as a psychological weapon by projecting unease into their enemies, yet the totality of the phenomenon remained unverified. The sealed reports emphasize that every battle left behind as many questions as tactical answers. Though the Lunar Wolves, Blood Angels and Emperor's Children ultimately eradicated the Megarachnid Empire within recorded territory, the anomalies remain preserved in files that carry warnings rather than conclusions. The lack of preserved artifacts, the unexplained collapses of structures, the missing detachments, and the untraceable methods of coordination all resist simple categorization. The final Inquisition memoranda on the subject do not declare the Megarachnids fully understood. Instead, they close with notes of caution. The species is listed as destroyed, but the mysteries surrounding its biology and methods ensure that the record is left open for future revision. The final sealed files concerning the Megarachnids, preserved only within the restricted archives of the Ordo Xenos, reflect a tone of unease rather than triumph. Where the Imperium's official record describes their extermination as a completed compliance, the Inquisition's internal documents are more tentative. The language used is cautious, filled with phrases such as provisional eradication, unknown variables, and continuing risk assessment. This discrepancy stems from the fact that too many anomalies surrounded the Megarachnids to allow for a definitive conclusion, and the disappearance of the species left as many mysteries unresolved as their existence had created. Classified memoranda note that the Megarachnids' empire, though centered on murder, extended further than initial Imperial cartographers believed. A small number of probe records retrieved from Mechanicus fleets charted possible outlying systems, showing signs of Megarachnid habitation or activity. In nearly all cases, these signals disappeared before follow-up expeditions could investigate. The Inquisition speculated that the species may have maintained remote colonies beyond the grasp of the Crusade's reach. While the principal empire was destroyed, the lack of complete confirmation left open the possibility of surviving enclaves. As a result, Ordo Xenos files continue to monitor deep space anomalies for centuries afterward, long after the Megarachnids were officially declared extinct. Another category of sealed reports involves the genetic material gathered during the campaigns. Samples preserved under heavy security revealed unstable properties that resisted long-term storage. Tissue degraded at unnatural rates, and preserved exoskeletal fragments dissolved within years despite containment. What little could be studied indicated a resilience and adaptability beyond baseline biology. The Ordo Xenos expressed repeated concern that the species may not have been a naturally evolved race but an engineered creation, designed for warfare or territorial defense. This possibility gave rise to classified debates between the Order Xenos and the Order Malleus, with some suggesting that warp-based manipulation might have played a role. Others argued for the hand of the Old Ones or another ancient power. No consensus was reached, but the suspicion that the Megarachnids were not an independent evolutionary phenomenon was entered into the record as a strong probability. The most heavily restricted files concern the fate of Imperial troops reported missing during the campaigns. The disappearance of entire companies without trace remains unexplained. Classified addenda attached to these cases suggest that fragments of captured human armor were recovered deep within Megarachnid hives, in galleries lined with organic material that registered faint warp resonance. No human remains were ever found, and no clear evidence exists as to the purpose of these structures. The Inquisition never released its final findings, but internal annotations speculate that the Megarachnids may have experimented on captives or preserved them for reasons unknown. Some suggest an attempt to replicate or study foreign biology, while more disturbing theories hint at sacrificial practices tied to the warp. These theories remain suppressed, sealed under designations reserved for matters deemed too destabilizing for broader circulation. The final thoughts of the Inquisition regarding the Megarachnids are consistently cautious. They are listed in the catalogues of the Ordo Xenos as destroyed, yet every summary of their case is marked with reservations. Species removed, purpose unknown, appears in multiple files as a concluding line. Their empire, though eradicated, is recognized as anomalous in its uniformity and organization. Their technology, crude yet inexplicably effective, does not align with known patterns of development. Their biology, resilient but unstable, hints at external influence. Their hostility toward intruders, absolute and indiscriminate, appears more like programming than natural instinct. Inquisitorial records therefore refrain from closing the matter completely. Instead, they recommend vigilance in monitoring uncharted regions for any trace of their survival. The possibility that the Megarachnids were designed as guardians for a greater power, or that they represent a remnant of a forgotten conflict older than human history, remains unconfirmed but troubling. The Inquisition's perspective is not of a species eliminated, but of a mystery set aside, buried beneath layers of Imperial victories yet never resolved in full. In conclusion, the classified files treat the Megarachnids as a case study in the limits of Imperial certainty. Their extermination removed an immediate threat, but not the questions they posed. The Ordo Xenos regards them as both extinct and unfinished, an entry in the archives marked as closed only in appearance. The true nature of their origin, their purpose, and their ultimate fate remain absent from all surviving data. This lack of resolution forms the final thought of the Inquisition, that the Megarachnids, though no longer encountered, cannot be said to be truly understood,